This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now, today we are going to continue in the vein of talking about Aztec deities, and we're going to talk about the Aztec death goddess, Mictecacíhuatl. Now, last time we talked about Coatzica, and there's some at least superficial similarities between that figure and Mictecacíhuatl. But the interesting thing about this particular figure is the way in which she fits into the entire Aztec cosmology or view of life and death. So what I'm going to talk about in this particular episode is I'm going to talk about her and talk about the mythology associated with her, which, by the way, there's not a lot, okay? There are not a lot of specific stories about her as the queen of the underworld. But we want to talk a little bit about her and about her husband, the king of the underworld, and what their role is, what the main stories are, and where they fit in. But also looking a little bit at the broader cosmology, the Aztecs and their, where they've come from, where how they ended up, how they rose to power, and what their kind of core beliefs were. Now, some of this we cover actually in the last episode. But I would like to go through some of that again and try to piece all of this together, because the role of the underworld and the view of this this particular goddess in this aspect is quite it's markedly different from what we tend to think of in our Western view, but there's a lot of similarities between that and what we might see. Again, just for comparative purposes, not suggesting that these are originating from the same place. But what we see in archaic Greek ideas, what we see in ancient Egyptian ideas about death and the underworld seems to be there's some notable similarities there, let's just say. And again, the fact that there are similarities does not imply that somehow they came from the same source or whatever. But I want to go through these different stories and just look at some of the things that I find notable in the symbols, in the conception of the Chthonic, and also of the kinds of ordeals that one must pass through in order to enter the underworld. Now, one thing I'm going to mention here is that I recorded, this is another example of one of the podcasts that I recorded in the time leading up to, coming to Ireland, which is where I am right now. Because the idea was that while I was here, I always try to do, I do a whole lot of research over a 6-month period, then I'll record all the podcasts within like a month's period of time, or at least I'll record 6 months worth. And then I have all of them to just simply post, because then if things come up, if I'm traveling, if things are happening, then there's always a podcast there. Well, this is another example. If you've been following this podcast, you know that a whole lot of my files were mucked up by the time I got over to England and then over here, for reasons that I still cannot quite figure out, because all these files were checked before I left, and then, they're back to being a problem again. But in any case, so I wanted to go post today's podcast, and I went, there's only 113 kilobytes. It's not actually there. I mean, the intro was there, so the people who liked the original intro, that was there, but nothing else was. So this not only meant that I had to retrieve my notes and start going over this again, but also that I had to remind myself about how all these names are pronounced again. So I spent a few hours this morning doing that. But the other thing, the only regret that I have right now about this is that I had a lot of information from the book entitled Underworld from Theon Publishing, which has a great section on Aztec underworld and Aztec, death mythology. But that book is at my house in New Jersey, so I will not be able to refer to that. So hopefully, we will still get through with the information that we need. So okay, so let's all administrative difficulties and logistics aside, Mictecacíhuatl is often portrayed in Aztec mythology as having a flayed body and a jaw that kind of hangs agape or open, because she devours the stars during the day. So that's the reason you don't see stars during the day, is because they've been swallowed by Mictecacíhuatl. Now, so she's either depicted as flayed, okay, her flesh being flayed, or as being defleshed entirely, being skeletal, but always with her jaw wide open. And the Aztecs often show her as having a skull face, a skirt made from serpents, and sagging breasts, which there we can see the similarity to Coatzica, because she also, because there's a root in there for the word serpent. And so once again, we see this goddess that's associated with this Chtonic goddess, who's associated with a space under the earth, just as Coatzica is a kind of an earth mother, an earth type figure, an earth goddess. They both have these skirts made from serpents, and so we have this idea in a lot of cultures. I said Western civilization being a very notable exception. When I say Western, I mean biblical. The serpent tends to be a representation of life, or life, death, and the return of life. There's that cyclical nature of the Ouroboros, the serpent that swallows its own tail. So they tend to be more of a positive, the presence of the serpent is presents a more positive view of life, and is life affirming in that sense. Okay. It's not doesn't fall into the category of the devious and the devilish and the satanic, which is a version that which that Adam and Eve serpent in the garden version of the serpent has tended to also give us a very negative view of life, nature, and of course of just the whole process of life and death. And as we see with the Aztecs, life and death are quite similar. They're not. I always say two sides of the same coin. They're part and parcel of the same thing. You don't have one without the other. Okay, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Aztec cosmology. And when we see in that cosmology, you see that where death fits into that structure. Now, the Aztecs themselves, and I don't know that I mentioned this in the last episode. Just a little background: they came to what we now think of as central Mexico. From the north, and around the 1200 CE. And their legends say that they come from a land called Aztlan, Aztlan or Aztlan, which is where the word Aztec comes from, and that they're actually they were not a single people, but rather several groups, including the Mexica and the Tanoca, I think is how you say that. And it says in the early 1300s, they formed an alliance and they founded a city-state called, let's see, make sure I say this right. I think it's Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, yeah, I think. Okay, that's one I did not look up, which is the site now of Mexico City. Okay, and they ended up having a large empire during the 1400s, of course, until we had the Spanish coming in and conquering this particular group, and of course annihilating these particular groups. But of course, some of the information that we have about the Aztecs does come from the Spanish colonists who came in during that time period, and also what's been interpreted from their from the calendars that have left. We think about the Mayan calendar a lot, but the Aztecs also had their own types of calendars, for divination and for determining the best times to do certain things. And so it's the attempts to decode those calendars tends to be another source of information for what we have about the Aztecs. Now, if we look at their cosmology, okay? Now, human life in this cosmology is, humans are rather insignificant. Death is, they're part of their, well, okay, maybe insignificant's not the right word. That that tends to be a bit of a judgment word that we see from a point of view where, from a humanist point of view, where we champion rationality and we say that humans with our rational consciousness are somehow set above all the rest of nature, okay? So really, when people say that this is insignificant, that you're seen as small and insignificant, it just simply means you're part of the process. You're not anything exceptional in the process. Your reason is another tool that you have, but you're not. It doesn't. Truthfully, sometimes it doesn't serve you well in dealing with the natural world. So, but humans are just part of this cycle of life and death. There's not this idea that the fact that you're human somehow makes you exceptional or sets you above. And of course, there's a very fatalistic view that you are subject to forces beyond your control, which is not an uncommon view that you see particularly. I mean, 1200 seems quite late if we compare it to what we see, say, for example, in the Mesopotamian region, the archaic peoples, where you see these beliefs from maybe about 1200 BCE, or earlier. But there's this idea of being controlled by that you are part of this cycle of nature, and a lot of this is very much out of your control. Your your survival is dependent on forces outside of yourself and how well you are able to work with them. So very similar to what we see in ancient Sumerian Babylon, you have this idea of the gods creating people to work and fight for them. Okay, there's the idea that there is this space. Now, the earth itself is supposed to come from a goddess that was. Let's see. They seize a woman from the sky. Okay, this particular version. There may be a name for this woman, but I don't have it. So in this particular world, now mind you, this is the world of the Aztecs was known as I think you would say this Nahuali, and that means four movement. And this was in the era of what they call the fifth sun. Now, what that means is that this is almost like a fifth age, that there were four quote unquote suns, S-U-N, suns before that, all which them were destroyed. And the sun, of course, is considered to be very central to life, or the continuation of life, as we are going to see. So the gods create mortals to do the work, just like they did, just like you see in Babylonian myth. And they don't grant favors. They don't directly protect. Again, very similar to the archaic religions, in which you don't have a direct relationship with the deity. These are merely forces that you try to interpret and understand. So you look to the natural world, you look to the forces around you to determine, what the gods actually want. And if you fail to serve the gods, then of course that could be doom and destruction. It's not really just about you and your individual life, but about, how that's going to affect the entire society. Hence the reliance on human sacrifice a lot of the time, which is quite central to Aztec ritual, as we've noted. Now, this idea of being in the world of the fifth sun, and Mictecacíhuatl's story comes out of this particular myth. Now, the Earth itself was said to be divided into like a flat disk. Okay, so there was this idea of a flat Earth, northeast, south, and west quarters, as we normally see, and each one associated with a color or a certain deity and a certain day. So just like we see Quetzalcoatl, who's one of the more well-known Aztec deities, is often associated with the color white in the west, for example. Now, the center of the earth, there was a fire deity called Huehueteotl, and there were 13 heavens above the earth, and there were 9 layers, 9 underworlds below the earth where the dead dwelt. Okay. Now, the myth about the creation of the earth is that a deity called Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl, they end up making the quartering the world by seizing a woman from the sky and pulling her in those directions, and her body becomes the earth. Okay, so once again we have this idea of a feminine earth, but it's almost like there was actually a type of corporal punishment in England many years ago, known as being hung, drawn, and quartered, which is where which again had to do with somebody being similarly having their limbs pulled in the four directions. It was a horrible way to die, and this quartering is literally the quartering of a woman. However, because they said this woman was angered by the way that she was treated, that this earth now devours the dead. Okay, so this is death takes place the way it does because the earth is angry about the way in which she was created, okay, or dealt with. So now this brings us back to Mictecacíhuatl and her son. I'm sorry, not her son. Her husband, who is let me just get his it's Mictlantecuhtli. Mictlantecuhtli. That's how you say her husband's name. And and they are the king queen of the underworld. Now, according to Aztec mythology, there were a number of gods that created the structure of the universe as we know it. And in this creation process, they created a number of gods. And Mictecacíhuatl and her husband were two of the gods created as the universe was structured. So the implication here is that death is an integral part of the structure of the universe. Okay? And so that, again, that differs very much from a sort of Western Christianized view that says that death is somehow something unnatural and doesn't belong into the equation or comes about because of a sin or something like that. This is a point of view of death that death is actually part of the whole structure. It's how it goes. It's another aspect of things. So Mictecacíhuatl is referred to as the keeper of the bones. Okay, so as humans die and of course their bodies decay, the bones are kept in the underworld, and she guards them, and they eventually are given to the gods to create new races of humans. They basically recycle the old bones, which is a rather interesting and different way of thinking about the idea of reincarnation. It's not, we think of the idea of souls being reincarnated, but these are literal parts of bodies that are reincarnated, okay? Or that are reconstituted, repurposed, as it were. Now, the myth goes that the dawn of the Fifth Age, which is the one that the Aztecs live in, there was no people in the world. So Quetzalcoatl decides to acquire the bones of original humans from the land of the dead. And so I'm going to read the story. Mictlantecuhtli told Quetzalcoatl that he could have the bones, but only if he went around Mictlan, which is the underworld. Mictlan is the name of the underworld, sounding a conch shell with no holes in it. Quetzalcoatl has worms drill a hole into the shell in this conch so that it could be played, and then he filled the shell with bees so that it sounded constantly. So after performing these tasks, Quetzalcoatl told Mictlantecuhtli that he had changed his mind and he was going to leave Mictlan without the bones. This, however, was a ruse to cover his escape, as he had secretly already taken the bones. But before he was able to escape, Mictlantecuhtli discovered his ruse and had a pit dug to trap him. And because Quetzalcoatl was distracted by a quail, he falls into a pit, causes the bones to scatter, and eventually he manages to gather up the bones and escape. So what he does is he mixes the bones with his blood and also with corn, like maize, like corn, and that creates the first humans of the Fifth Age. Okay. And so this was the reason that the Aztecs said that there were different races and people of different heights and sizes and shapes, because the original humans were, whatever, because all of these bones from all these different places ended up being mixed up in the way that they were. Sorry, I'm sitting on the floor here and I had to move my foot. Okay, so Mictecacíhuatl and her husband are the keeper of these bones. So, he's mentioned in this story, but the implication is that she was involved with this as well. And so this role that she has, she has this role, and not so we see there, okay, if she is in fact the keeper of the bones, then not only does she have to do with death and decay, but she also has to do with new life forming. Okay, that new human life is formed through death and decay. That this is she's the gatekeeper, as it were, of both. Okay, now the other story associated with Mictecacíhuatl has to do with her origins, because as we mentioned, she and her husband were created as part of the structure of the universe. This was the structuring of the the original, the structure of the cosmos includes death. However, as an infant, when she is born, she is immediately, as soon as she comes into being, she's immediately sacrificed to the sun. Okay. And this was also a very common belief. The sun is the source of life. It is the reason which Earth as it is can exist, okay, in this way of thinking. So what ends up happening is that, because she ends up being sacrificed, and of course now she comes back as this queen of the underworld, because now she's immediately born and dies, and now she's, this becomes her role. She becomes the wife of Mictecacíhuatl. Okay. Always going to have a little bit of trouble with these names, as I don't speak that particular dialect. I don't speak Spanish at all. Let's be real. So it's okay. So we have this idea of her as this queen of the underworld, and we also have her as kind of this sort of original sacrificial victim. Now, Aztecs practiced a lot of human sacrifice, and the idea was that the sacrifices went for the sun. I mean, the gods themselves sacrificed themselves and gave their blood to the sun. Of course, which also implies the idea of the Aztecs as having, Aztec gods as having these kind of corporeal bodies that had blood. Okay, which is not necessarily something you see in other mythologies. So, the gods have have some kind of substance that can be sacrificed as well as people. So, and in order for things to continue, this regular tribute has to be made. Okay. Now, because these victims are sacrificed to the sun, the assumption is that the sacrificial victims do not go to Mictlan. They go to this paradise region, just as of the sun. And there's two different names for it. Let me just look at my notes here and see what they pronounce them correctly. There's one called Omayuken, or Omayukan, if I'm saying that right. Inflection right there. And Telalocan is the other one. Okay, they are these are like paradise regions in the region of the sun. They are considered to be, these worlds of light and warmth, as opposed to Mictlan, which of course, being under the earth, is dark and probably very much colder. So the let me just find my note here again, because I'm kind of working in a very strange way today to try to get this done. Yes, okay. So what I was going to say is that there are, not only did you have sacrifice victims going to this region, but you also had mothers who died in childbirth, and also infants. Okay, these did not go to the underworld; they went to this paradise region. Okay, Perhaps because mothers who die in childbirth are perhaps seen as making a kind of sacrifice as well. There's a sacrifice of themselves for the continuation of life. So it makes sense that this is viewed in this kind of a cosmology and afterlife view, that this would be seen as a heroic act. Now, those who, that said, in Mictlan, there were three types of souls in the underworld. There's those who died normal deaths. There's those who died heroic deaths. So heroes do go to Mictlan. It's only specifically warriors, those who die in battle, that are supposedly go to these other regions that are paradises. And of course, the non-heroic also go to the underworld. Although it's interesting, is I'm kind of thinking, what's the difference between normal and non-heroic? This is a categorization I've seen in one of these myth encyclopedias. Normal, heroic, and non-heroic, and I'm like, well, to a certain extent, a normal death probably is non-heroic, or maybe it is heroic. I don't know. Anyway, you have the idea that basically average, everybody pretty much went to the underworld except for these few exceptional classes of people. A mother who died in childbirth and their infants, if they died, and, warriors who die in battle, and those who become sacrifices. And of course, if the idea is that when you die that you're going to be going to this paradise region of the sun, perhaps people would be more willing to be sacrificed, although it is known that a lot of the human sacrifices may have been prisoners of war for the Aztecs. So in a way, I think they probably felt they were doing them a favor by doing that. So yeah, and of course, so when the dead were buried, there were offerings made to Mictecacíhuatl and to her husband, so that people would ensure their own safety when they had to make their own journey to the underworld. Now, the living actually had a fair amount to do. If you had an ancestor who died, somebody in your family dies, you are supposed to provide, to help them in the journey that they have to make through the 9 levels of the underworld to finally achieve rest. And, this would involve making offerings at the graves and so forth. I mean, you see the modern Day of the Dead ceremonies, okay? They certainly harken back to this and are connected to this idea. And again, this kind of veneration of the ancestors, making offerings at the grave, making offerings, this idea of, like you would see in the ancient tombs, again, in the Near East, where, the Egyptian tombs, where you had very elaborate things left behind. But also, what you see in ancient Rome, in particular, you had specific festivals where these things were given, where offerings of food and other kinds of provisions are made to feed the dead, as it were. And what's interesting, too, to me, is that the idea of life is fed through the giving of blood. Something that we would see you see this, okay, again, not to overly compare it with Greek, but that's the thing I'm most familiar with. If we look at the Odyssey and see the idea that, it's blood that's required for the dead to speak as they come up from the underworld. There's definitely this strong connection between blood and not only, as the animator of the human soul or, spirit or whatever you want to call it, but also as, somehow, blood flowing through and animating the cosmos. Okay. So, I think the other thing that's worth noting here before I get into discussing the Aztec underworld is the fact that, and I think I did say this in the last episode, is that, when we talk about the Chthonia, normally when we talk about the Chthonia, when we talk about the layer, below the earth, what goes on beneath the earth, the underworld, we usually think of the earth as being that place, as being that scary, dark, dangerous place. However, or if we think of, okay, I think maybe to put that more clearly, if we think about this idea that we have of hell being under the earth, okay, that being the realm of the demonic or the satanic or something like that, in the not in the sense that I actually think of them, but in the sense that people tend to think of them in the mainstream. Okay. In Aztec mythology, the assault doesn't come from anything in the underworld. The assault comes from the sky. Actually, it's celestial. Deep space is where the threats come from. There are certain stars that are inimical to the continuation of life on Earth. So that is where the threat comes from, and that's why the sun needs to be fueled to be able to keep up, to keep these other stars from attacking or influencing or destroying. And who knows? I mean, in a more literal sense, you don't know if that was, for example, meteors falling from the sky or something like that, if that that contributes to that kind of perception. I always tend to think there's more than just a external event that prompts the story. There's usually more to it than that. Symbolic things that are embedded in cosmologies tend to go a lot deeper than just a surface event. Okay, so there's probably is, but one might wonder, like if a meteor falls and hits and leaves a massive crater or wipes something out, you might think of that as the stars attacking the Earth, right? So that's certainly a possibility there. But nonetheless, it's very interesting because what we see, again, on the other side of the ocean is we tend to see a view that what is celestial has to do with light and with day and with civilization and, with intellect and with all these wonderful things. Whereas the earth has to do with, death, may have to do with sensuality, may have to do with, these things that in modern ethical religion tend to be thought of as quote unquote sinful. Okay. And so, and because of the temporary nature of things, I mean, you see this in Eastern religion as well. The temporary nature of life on earth makes it less desirable than some kind of eternal life somewhere, or eternal, or life of, non-attachment to the sensual, right? We always tend to think on a spiritual path about that one must not be attached to things of the earth because somehow they're not valuable in some way. Which is not a point of view that I espouse, by the way, but that's that does tend to be the going narrative, and you will see it regardless of where you go in this, in any kind of spiritual community. Well, maybe not any. Maybe any is an overstatement, but let's just say most. Okay, so you have this idea of the Chtonic as a, as a realm to be, well, really, it's a realm to be honored and respected. It is considered to be part of the natural process, which is, again, which makes a huge difference in how you approach it. We live in absolute rapt fear of death, and this is a culture that, doesn't really fear death. And your attitude towards death really does determine your attitude towards life. If you spend your life living in fear of change, living in fear of loss, then you will not, it's not very likely you're going to enjoy life very much. Okay. Life is going to be something that is, there's always going to be the threat of death overhanging it. You know what I mean? There's always going to be this sense of, or there's going to be a complete denial of death, on the other hand. Like it's not a thing. It's not going to happen to me. And then when major shifts and changes occur, which really is, there's a lot of reason that, when you see certain rituals in cultures, not rituals like we really have anymore in any significant way, they're meant to be initiations into these little deaths, these little changes that we have in life. But we don't have those anymore. They're not part of our culture. We just we kind of gloss over them, or you'll if you are religious in any way, you might have a ceremony that says a bunch of words and you have a party, and it's not a real transition. Okay, it doesn't have the ritual doesn't have the effect that it really needs to on allowing you to make that transition. So yeah, so it's there, when you have a culture that either fears and denies death at the same time, or feels that death needs something to be conquered, it can leave you in a very alienated state, can leave you very cut off from life as it is, and making you feel like basically that everything you do to enjoy life is somehow wrong. So it'd be interesting, again, we don't know what the day-to-day mindset was of the day-to-day Aztec person. All we have is, as usual, we have the accounts of the conquerors, and we also have, just what we can glean from their, from the calendars and the symbols that we have in their writings. But there's not really, there's very little in terms of, we don't really have a good view of the day-to-day life of an Aztec, how they felt about any of this. But if we look at more modern ceremonies like that, or if we look at more modern groups or modern celebrations of death, particularly female death, like the Santa Muerte, for example, and in fact, the Day of the Dead is celebrated and things like that. There does seem to be a more accepting attitude towards death, and more of a welcoming of it as part of life, which will make a huge difference. Of course, on the other hand, this is also, in modern, tends to be done in the context of Catholicism, which is a little weird because Catholicism is, again, this is usually a cultural reinterpretation of what we would think of as traditional dogmatic Roman Catholicism. But Catholicism itself is about, like Christ conquering death and things like that. So, I don't know. It's a weird kind of mashup of the two when you think about how they both have sort of opposite views on death. So anyway, let's move on to talking about the underworld. Okay, so when a person dies, again, this is the average person. This is not the person going to paradise, not the sacrifice victim, or the slain warrior, or the mother who dies giving birth, or the infant. We now, just basically everybody else, when you have to go through the 9 levels of Mictlan when you die. Now, this process is full of obstacles, okay? And it was said to last for about, so what I'm seeing here is 4 years. Think I've heard other numbers too, but the source I have here has said 4 years. Okay, and so this, and of course, what's interesting is that to pass through those 9 levels, you have to pass through a series of obstacles. So let me explain to you, I'll read to you what each one of these are. So when you, okay, so you eventually achieve eternal rest when you get down to where Mictecacíhuatl and Mictecacíhuatl reside, where their kingdom is at the bottom, where their home is at the bottom. That's where you will have eternal rest. So that is what they bring. But the first stage, you have to cross the Apanoia. It's a river with the help of a dog that's either white or vermilion in color, called, let's see if I can get this right, Chthonia is the name of this dog, okay? And the color of the dog was the only way to see, the bright color of the dog was the only way to see in a place of darkness, okay? Now, okay, so first off here, we have the idea of a dog, and there is actually another stage. It wasn't mentioned in this other source that I've used, but I remember the Underworld book mentioned it, that there is another level at which a dog also acts as a guide. But this is the only one that's mentioned in this particular source that I'm using on, Aztec mythology. So you have this dog that helps this person see their way in the darkness. And again, it's worth pointing out the similarities to, for example, Anubis in Egyptian mythology, who people will tell me, well, Anubis is not a dog. No, but Anubis is a jackal, and a jackal is a canine. So we have the idea of a canine acting as a guide. We certainly see the gates of the underworld in Greek mythology are guarded by a 3-headed dog, and called Kerberos. And then also you've got the goddess Hecate, who's in the underworld, and her chief animal is in fact, a dog. Dogs are very much associated with her. They were sacrificed to her. And so she is, so yeah, there's this association. And Hecate, of course, is a deity that lights the way through the underworld, right? She uses her torch to help one see in the darkness. So it's very interesting to see the dog in different cultural contexts being used as the animal that lights, that's able, to show one the way through the underworld path. So, and that could be because dogs are, so their association with hunting or their association with searching, the way we think with dogs, their ability to sniff out and find certain things, or to find, to find a path, through somewhere, and the way that they've been, trained by humans to do that. But also even just, if you think about the nature of coyotes and other canines, they have a very good homing instinct. They have a very good, way of tracking and finding their way through things. So this may well be the reason that dogs are, are associated with that particular task. Okay. So the next level after this first stage is called the, let's see, I hope I'm saying this one correctly, Tepame Monomictlin, okay, which is a place where the hills get together and, so they basically block the path of the soul, and the soul has to wait to continue on its way. So now we have the idea of the mountains standing as a barrier. Once you get through the darkness, now you're facing the mountains. And, if we think again about the way we tend to symbolically view a mountain, like expressions like making a mountain out of a molehill, right? So in other words, turning something into a very large obstacle. Okay, the idea that one must climb or cross a mountain, and that ascent is very trying and very difficult. In this case, it's literally something that creates a barrier that leaves one stuck. It's literally one cannot move forward, until presumably until these hills move aside and let them go through. But it has to, but there's this idea that they have to wait, to get past this particular set of obstacles. Okay, so then the next level after that, the third level, is called Itsepetle, I think is how you say that. And this obstacle the souls have to cross a path of obsidian. Now, obsidian, of course, is a black stone. And so, again, you have this idea of darkness, but you also have this idea of this, this very hard and shiny stone that one must that is black in nature. So again, you have this idea of not only passing through darkness, but trying to pass through a realm where you may be dealing with something, something that they can act as a kind of a solid barrier of some kind. Okay, so this is a path that they must cross, a path of obsidian. Okay, now the fourth level is called Sehueluan, which is a place with a lot of snow. And the spirit there remembers the saddest moments of their life. But they do have to go through this snowy path. So again, when we look at snow, I am thinking about some of the Norse conceptions of the underworld, and some of these others, and even you see it sometimes in Far Eastern mythologies as well. The idea of the snowy path, or the snow is being connected to the underworld. Now you've got water. You think of water as something that flows. Now, when it becomes ice, when it becomes snow, now this is water that has been slowed down, that is stopped. Again, there's this idea of stuckness, and in this case, it's particularly associated with sadness. Okay, that this is, and so there's that coldness there, that lack of warmth, the isolation that we often associate with that. Because really, a lot of human sadness does come out of isolation and separation, whether it be feeling the loss of a particular individual, or the loss of one's connection to a group, or feeling not connected to a group. It's the feeling of the foreigner, as it were. Often is associated with that sadness of not being part of the group that you're in. Okay, so in order for the spirit to get rid of this, and also it's worth noting that the spirit is passing through these things to leave them behind. Okay, very similar to the descent of Inanna, where she has to remove her rich trappings of the outer world, and approach Ereshkigal in the underworld completely naked and completely devoid of everything. Like, you give everything up in death. And, the lesson there, of course, is that, oftentimes in order to move forward or to move through a change, you have to let things go. You have to let everything go. Okay? And that's the hardest thing for us to do. Because we have attachments to certain things. We're willing to let go of some things and not others. So, Okay, so you have this this fourth level. Sorry, I have to keep moving myself around here. Okay, so in the fifth level, which is considered to be roughly the middle of the journey here, we have a place called, let's see if I say this right, Panquet La Caloyan. I think that's right. Panquet La Caloyan, that's what it looks like. Okay. And this is a place of wind, okay, where the wind is buffeting you, and it's so much wind that the souls can't overcome it and end up being blown away. Now, if we think about associations with wind, if anybody, people who practice divination or deal with, like something like tarot, for example, when we talk about wind, we talk about air, okay? Air is usually a symbol of the intellect. And so these are the things that we know or that we think we know, or the way in which our mind often overwhelms us. So the idea that one cannot overcome it, it's almost like you're just being hit by all these, by this strong blast of wind, by this strong blast of intellect, as it were. Now, again, I'm speaking about this on a more psychological level, the way it might be interpreted not for a literal death of a soul moving through the underworld, but the way in which our own psyches undergo transformation. Okay, if you look at it from that perspective. To me, the wind is like there's so many thoughts, there's so many rationalizations that your rationalization actually becomes a barrier. Okay, but there's definitely this sense that you have this idea of being first buffeted by snow, which of course probably has to do with emotional distress, and then of course now you have to do with wind, which is intellectual distress. Okay. And then the darkness, of course, it just represents, and that lack of clarity, and the mountains, the obstacles, they're just the regular external obstacles that we face, trying to do the things that we want to do. So that's more of a psychological interpretation. But just thinking about that in connection with this, this is what comes to my mind. Okay, so the next level, the sixth level, is called, Timaminaloyan, I think is how you say that, where invisible hands throw arrows that must be dodged, and each arrow represents a person who has an influence on the life of the departed. Okay, so this has to do, just as the snowy place has to do with perhaps that sense of isolation, this has to do with those people who you are still attached to. Okay, the relationships that you have. And that have influenced you, which, may have served you perfectly well in life, but in death they have to be let go of. Okay. The seventh level, now there's no name given to this one here, but they say there's a jaguar that deprives a soul of its heart. For at this stage, the departed abandon anything worldly they still carry with them. Okay. And a jaguar, it's worth noting that in one of the first four, I think it's actually was when they talk about this being the realm of the fifth time, or the realm of the fifth sun, that in the realm of the first sun, it's said that it was a jaguar that ends up, being set loose on the earth and devouring everything. So in this case, it talks about taking the heart of the person. So again, depending on how the Aztecs saw the heart, obviously the heart was something that they carved out in terms of sacrifice. So obviously it was very important and central to life. And to one's vitality. So so whatever vitality you might have left, now that you've released all of those other things, now the heart, which is the center of your system, is now taken away by a jaguar, which is this is more of a feline figure rather than a canine one. Okay. So we're talking about the big cat that comes in and take that, and that takes the heart away. So so again, different from the dog view, although it's in one of these other levels. I want to say it's the one with the arrows. I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me. If I can, when I get a hold of the book that tells me what that was, I will be able to provide an update or a correction on that. But there is, it's one of those. I felt like that it was the dog that helped people dodge the arrows, but I'm not 100% sure, and so I'm not going to put that forward as a fact. But that, I feel like I recall reading that, but I could be misremembering. So, okay, so the 8th level is called Apanohualoyan, which is where the departed see their life pass. Okay, so now we've got, so now we're talking about time. Okay, the way in which one, or the way in which one looks back at the past. Okay, because the past is something else that can potentially hold you back. Now, you've let go of all the things in life, and now you have to let go of, all of your memories or so of the past. And it's, which in a way, and again, in Greek mythology, we see that as drinking from the river Lethe, right? One forgets, one learns to forget. But although this is a bit different because, this actually is a little bit more reminiscent of what we hear about when people say, when they're in a critical moment where they might, in a critical condition where either they die or they come, they're dead and they come back to life, like doctors are able to revive them, where you may see your life pass before your eyes, and it's what it makes you think of, right? So you have this idea of having the life pass, okay? And then the final level is Chikonahualoyan, which is where the souls finally meet Mictecacíhuatl and Mictecacíhuatl, and they have their eternal rest. So their labors are over by the time they reach the king and queen of the underworld. And it's been noted that Mictecacíhuatl is a bit like Hades in his role. He is he's very passive. He's worried about controlling his realm. He has nothing to do with punishment. These are not meant to be punishments. They're initiations. They're passing through. They're that releasing. It's that same ancient idea that in death you let go of everything that is associated with life. And so then, of course, if the bones are gathered and the spirits are to be reborn, or they're to be, reconstituted into a new body, then there's nothing that nothing that's being carried with you from anywhere else. And what's interesting too, it occurs to me when I think about the Platonic view of the earth and the way in which the Greek underworld, the Greek afterlife conception, shall we say, gets shifted to the sky, and the moon becomes the realm of Hecate. She has that intermediary role, and then the souls end up going to the sun, or the sun is the realm of the gods. But that Hades ends up kind of being associated with this celestial realm rather than what's under the earth. But Plato often talked about it as, the souls who, live the kind of life that he would think was a good life. Usually philosophers, as I've noted, they will rise up because they don't have anything to weight them down. They rise up, okay? But that souls that have, baggage, things weighing on them, that they go down to the depths, that they go into the underworld. And here we actually, again, see quite the opposite, just as we do in Babylonian myth. It's the idea that when you enter the underworld, you are light. You unburden yourself as you go. And so by the time you reach the depths, you are light. You have nothing, you have none of this other baggage to carry with you. So it really kind of flies in the face of the Platonic idea that life is something, or that dealing with the earth and what's under the earth is something that weighs you down, that gives you too much density and that weighs you down. This is a complete direct contradiction of that idea. So we've talked a little bit about this, and I don't know if I have too much else to say on Mictecacíhuatl herself, because that is the extent of the stories that there are about her specifically. The one having to do with her being sacrificed as an infant, and the one having to do with this, mixing up of the bones to create this fifth race of humans. And her role as the keeper of those bones. So it's just, I think it's just worth noting this again, as I've mentioned in the last podcast, this connection to death, this idea of death as rest, this idea of death as being an unburdening, and also the idea that death is not necessarily something that is so horrible. Let's face it, none of us really want to die, right? We enjoy our lives, but there is this idea that this is part of the process. And this underworld descent, it's not about punishing you, but it's about, getting rid of the stuff that you carry with you. And that's really the hardest thing. There's a bit of a lesson in that, I think, because, frequently when I read for others and also when I read for myself, I will see things that, someone will be going through some kind of a crisis, whether they've had a lost death in the family, whether they're thinking about whether they continue with a job, whether they've just gotten out of a relationship, whatever it is, there's always this sense, and even just the person who is, been kind of living their day-to-day life and but feels like they need to do something different. There's always, the cards that always come up always are cards of letting go. Eight of Cups is a good one, where you see these 8 upright cups and you just see this person turn their back and walk away. And of course there's an eclipsed moon in the sky. It's the idea that one, this brings about this breaking. Yes, I have all of these things, and all of these things have served me, and we're good. But at some point you need to walk. We always think about walking away from bad stuff, right? Toxic relationships and toxic people or toxic emotions. But there's other things that perhaps are not, we wouldn't think of as toxic, that may also be things we have to get rid of as well. And so really in death here you see a real freedom. There's a real freedom. There's a whole process of freeing you from things that you don't, that actually maybe weigh you down, and you don't think of them as weighing you down. So there's a total freedom that comes with death in this particular view. But if we think about this underworld journey metaphorically, in terms of dealing with death in our own psyches and in our own day-to-day lives, again, as we encounter these things, and you will, you cannot possibly be a living human and not run into this. We all run into things where major changes occur in spite of what we want. And some people have an inability to let go. But as you can see, letting go takes a lot of work, and it can be very painful. And that's the problem that we have. It's a problem I have as a life coach too, because people frequently, they come to you because they want an easy solution. People they pick up spiritual paths because they think, I'm going to dedicate myself to whomever, whether you're a Christian who feels that you're saved by Jesus, whether you're whether you join Buddhism or Hinduism, or whether you join some other kind of get involved in some other kind of, quote unquote spirituality. You often are doing it because you think somehow it's going to better you in some way, or that at the end of it, you're going to feel peace, or you're going to feel, and potentially, yeah, that could happen. But generally, or you'll start on a path and you'll start out feeling perhaps very blissful or very connected, and you think, oh, this is great. I've arrived at something. But you haven't arrived at anything. You've only started. And the process is long and it's painful. And a lot of times people think, well, see, that means you shouldn't go through the process. Well, no, you're going to go through it one way or the other, even if you have no no professed spirituality whatsoever. Your life is always a process. You're always learning things. The person you were at, if you're my age now, if you're like 50 or even older than me, people who are older than me, or people who are younger, if you are 20 years old, if I look at the 20-year-old, Breach, and I think about myself now, I'm like, all the stuff that I thought I knew at 20 and 21, I'm like, you realize later you don't really know anything. But even if I hadn't been on a spiritual path, there's no way your life experience doesn't make you the same person. The passage of time and your experience makes you a different person. And so there's all of these things that you accrue, and then it's a question of, okay, as you move through loss, of something, how do you release that? How do you let it go? So, I think the Aztecs, and I think this mythology of Mictecacíhuatl and Mictecacíhuatl are is showing us, it's actually showing you a truth, I think is what I'm trying to say. It's trying to show you a truth about the human psyche and about, life and how we experience life and how we deal with the world, in that, all of the things that you gain in life, that they are attached to. And it also makes me think, if you're a sacrifice victim in this case, if you're somebody who's offered for human sacrifice, which is, it was a painful affair for the Aztecs. I mean, people had their hearts cut out. I mean, it's still beating. That it's not a pleasant thing, but to offer oneself for sacrifice means that one very boldly meets death. Okay, one very, very boldly, faces up to death. So therefore, in that act, all those attachments are already gone. Okay, which is why the sacrificial act, which is why in a lot of cultures the sacrificial act is what makes one a king. If you look at the Jesus myth, I mean, the reason Jesus is considered, because Jesus basically just, he moves, just walks up and embraces, a torturous death, right? I mean, in the mythology of that. And so, so there's this idea, so there is actually still kind of this idea of the power of the sacrifice in a way, not to overcome death, but to overcome the obstacles that we face in gaining the freedom of death, I think is probably the way that I would look at that. And perhaps the way that ought to be looked at it, rather than the idea of being saved from something in particular, because you're not being saved from death. What you really eventually want to get rid of are all of the things that have caused you sorrow, or all of the things that have, in some fashion, held you to a place that you shouldn't be, or that you don't need to be. And when I look at all of these underworld trials that the souls face, some of them too, like with the mountains, and there's this idea of being forced to wait. And all of us hate waiting. We want stuff to happen now. That's another big obstacle. All these things that bring about the anxiety and the unsettledness of being alive. So anyway, just some thoughts that I have on this. I want to thank you all very much again for listening. Please check out Chthonia.net for all of my work. I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook as Chthonia Podcast, 2 words. I am on Instagram and Twitter as Chthonia Podcast, 1 word. And I'm also on YouTube as just Chthonia, if you happen to be watching this in the video version. Please stay tuned for Chthonia Conversations. I have them pretty much every month, unless something gets, delayed, then, sometimes I might, potentially I'd miss one, but as of right now, as of recording, I have at least 3 new ones that will be coming up in June, July, and August. So, we are, sort of back on schedule with that. And, there's plenty of other things. I have some new publications coming out. If you join my Patreon, I keep patrons abreast of all the new things going on. I usually post to patrons first about podcasts that are coming out for the week, and we'll also provide some extra material for people, usually at the $5 level and above. I have extra recordings every month and things like that. So if that interests you, I'd be delighted to have you as a patron. And with all of that, I just want to say thanks again for listening. Thank you to all of my patrons, and until the next episode.